The steel-grey clouds over the outskirts of Stuttgart hung low in the autumn of 1943, casting a perpetual shadow over the industrial complex that had once manufactured civilian automobiles. Now, behind the high walls topped with barbed wire, the facility served a different purpose. Inside Hangar 7, a group of engineers stood in a semicircle around an object that seemed almost alien in this landscape of German precision. It was an American Jeep, captured intact during a skirmish in North Africa, its olive-drab paint still dusty from the desert sands. Karl Hoffmann removed his wire-rimmed glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a habit he had developed over 30 years of engineering work. At 52, he was the senior technical director of the Military Vehicle Assessment Division, a man whose entire career had been built on the principle that German engineering was the pinnacle of human achievement. The lines on his weathered face deepened as he stared at the vehicle before him, a machine so utterly different from anything he had seen in his decades of experience. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, I want to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more incredible historical stories like this one. Now, back to Stuttgart, 1943. The morning air inside the hangar was cold enough to see your breath. Werner Schulz, a 28-year-old mechanical engineer with a doctorate from the Technical University of Berlin, circled the Jeep slowly, notebook in hand. He had been part of the team that designed improvements for the Kübelwagen, Germany's answer to lightweight military transport. That vehicle, with its sophisticated air-cooled engine and careful weight distribution, represented what Werner believed was the correct approach to military vehicle design. This American contraption seemed to mock everything he had learned. Beside Werner stood Friedrich Bauer, 41, a production engineer whose specialty was manufacturing efficiency. Friedrich had spent the last decade optimizing assembly line processes, reducing production time, improving quality control. He approached every problem with the mind of someone who understood that war was won not just with superior design, but with the ability to produce equipment faster than the enemy could destroy it. His thick fingers traced the Jeep's hood, and he felt something that disturbed him deeply. The metal was thinner than he expected, almost flimsy. The fourth member of their team was Hans Müller, 35, a metallurgist and materials specialist. Hans had been instrumental in developing the alloy specifications for tank armor, and his knowledge of metal properties was considered unmatched within the Reich's engineering corps. He carried a small toolkit and was already examining the Jeep's frame with the intensity of a surgeon studying a particularly unusual patient. Colonel Ernst Dietrich stood apart from the engineers, arms crossed over his chest. At 48, the colonel had seen combat in the Great War and understood machinery from the perspective of someone whose life had depended on it working under the worst possible conditions. He had requested this evaluation personally after seeing reports from North Africa. German forces were encountering these American vehicles everywhere, and they were proving remarkably effective. The High Command wanted to know why, and more importantly, whether German industry could replicate them. Karl cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice carried the authority of experience and the slight tremor of a man who was beginning to suspect that this assignment would not conclude as simply as he had hoped. He had been told the task was straightforward. Examine the vehicle, document its construction, identify its specifications, and provide a timeline for German production. Simple, routine. He had done similar evaluations dozens of times before. Werner, you will begin with the engine, Karl directed, his tone professional and measured. Friedrich, focus on the manufacturing processes, anything you can determine from the construction methods. Hans, I want a complete materials analysis. Colonel Dietrich and I will document the overall design philosophy. The engineers dispersed to their assigned tasks, and the hangar filled with the sounds of tools against metal, the scratch of pencils on paper, the occasional muttered comment. Werner approached the engine compartment with confidence, expecting to find something crude, something that would confirm his assumptions about American industrial design. What he found instead made him stop completely. The engine was a 4-cylinder unit, nothing revolutionary about that. But as Werner began to examine it more closely, his confidence started to evaporate like morning fog under a harsh sun. The engine was built to tolerances that were, frankly, loose. Components that German engineering would have machined to within 1/100th of a millimeter showed variations that would have failed quality inspection at any German facility. And yet, the engine ran. More than ran, according to the field reports, it ran reliably under conditions that would have destroyed more precisely manufactured units. Werner called Hans over, his voice tight with confusion. "Look at this cylinder head. The casting is rough, almost primitive. These tolerances would never pass inspection in any German factory." Hans examined the component carefully. Running his fingers over the metal surface, he pulled out a small magnifying glass and studied the grain structure. After several long minutes, he straightened up and met Werner's eyes. The American approach to metallurgy was radically different. They were not pursuing perfection in individual components. They were pursuing reliability through simplicity and ease of replacement. "This metal is lower quality than what we would use, but it requires less specialized processing. Any reasonably equipped factory could manufacture this." "That should be a weakness," Werner insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Should be," Hans agreed, "but according to the field reports, these engines are still running after treatment that would have seized our units solid." Friedrich had been examining the body construction, and his findings were equally troubling. He called the others over to the vehicle's chassis, pointing at the welds and joints. "Gentlemen, observe the construction methodology. This is spot-welded, using techniques that prioritize speed over elegance. The body panels are stamped steel, relatively thin. Minimal compound curves to simplify die manufacturing. Everything about this vehicle's construction screams mass production." Karl joined them, his notebook already filling with observations that contradicted his expectations. "But mass production implies sacrificing quality," he stated, though the statement felt increasingly hollow, even as he said it. "In German terms, yes," Friedrich responded, running his hand along a body seam. "But the Americans have redefined what quality means in this context. They are not building vehicles to last 20 years. They are building vehicles to last through a campaign, to be manufactured by the tens of thousands, to be repaired by relatively unskilled mechanics in field conditions. This vehicle is not designed to be perfect. It is designed to be good enough and to be everywhere." The implications of this philosophy were staggering. Colonel Dietrich, who had been listening carefully, spoke up for the first time. "In North Africa, our forces reported that for every German vehicle, they were encountering 5 or 6 of these jeeps. When one broke down, the Americans simply abandoned it and used another. When our vehicles broke down, we had to spend days making repairs because we could not replace them." Werner moved to the suspension system, and here he found perhaps the most disturbing evidence yet. The suspension was simple, almost agricultural in its directness. Leaf springs, solid axles, no attempt at the sophisticated independent suspension systems that German engineers favored. It should have been inferior, should have provided a rougher ride, should have been less capable in difficult terrain. "Should have been," Werner muttered to himself, a phrase that was becoming a bitter mantra. He examined the ground clearance, the approach and departure angles, the simplicity of the design that meant fewer points of failure. A German vehicle with similar off-road capability would have been far more complex, far more expensive, and far more difficult to maintain in field conditions. The American designers had stripped away everything that was not absolutely essential, and in doing so, they had created something that worked better in the real world than more sophisticated alternatives. The days passed, and the hangar became a laboratory of mounting consternation. Each system they examined revealed the same pattern. Simple construction, loose tolerances, inexpensive materials, and yet the complete package functioned with a reliability that German vehicles could not match. The engineers worked late into the evenings, long after the factory workers had gone home, the hangar illuminated by harsh electric lights that cast sharp shadows. On the fifth day of evaluation, Werner brought in detailed specifications from the Kübelwagen production line. He spread the documents across a makeshift table, comparing every measurement, every tolerance, every material specification with what they were finding in the American vehicle. The contrast was so stark, it seemed almost designed to mock German engineering philosophy. Friedrich stood beside him, reviewing the production data with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years on factory floors. The Kübelwagen requires approximately 240 hours of assembly time, he said quietly, his finger tracing down a column of numbers. This includes final quality control, adjustments, and testing. Based on the construction methods I'm observing in this Jeep, I estimate the Americans are assembling these vehicles in less than 40 hours. That is impossible, Werner protested, but the protest sounded weak even to his own ears. It should be impossible, Friedrich corrected him. But look at the design choices. Every component is designed for rapid assembly. The body panels attach with simple bolts, no precise alignment required. The wiring harness is external, running along the frame where it can be installed and serviced quickly. The engine mounts use rubber bushings that accommodate tolerance variations. The Americans have eliminated every feature that would slow down assembly or require skilled adjustment. Hans had moved on to examining the tires, and what he found there added another layer to the puzzle. These are not sophisticated tires, he called out to the others. The tread pattern is simple, almost crude. The rubber compound is basic, but the size, gentlemen, the size is brilliant. These large tires provide ground clearance and distribute the vehicle's weight over a larger area. They compensate for the lack of sophisticated suspension through simple physics. Karl recorded every observation, his engineering notebook filling with sketches, measurements, and increasingly troubled commentary. He had begun the evaluation with the confidence of a man who understood his field completely. Now, less than a week into the assessment, he was confronting the reality that his understanding might be fundamentally flawed. That evening, after the others had left, Karl remained in the hangar alone with the Jeep. He walked around it slowly, examining it from every angle, trying to understand the minds of the engineers who had created it. They had not been trying to build the best vehicle. They had been trying to build the right vehicle for a specific purpose. That was a subtle distinction, but it changed everything. Karl thought about his own career, the vehicles he had helped design, beautiful machines, sophisticated in their engineering, impressive in their performance specifications. But how many of them had actually served their intended purpose effectively? How many had been too complex for field maintenance, too expensive to produce in meaningful numbers, too fragile for combat conditions? The next morning brought a new challenge. Colonel Dietrich arrived with a stack of field reports from various theaters of war. Intelligence had been collecting observations about American vehicles for months, and the colonel wanted the engineers to review these reports as part of their evaluation. Werner took the reports from North Africa, where the Jeep had first made its presence felt in large numbers. He read account after account of German soldiers expressing grudging respect for the American vehicle. One report, written by a panzer officer, was particularly striking. "The American Jeep appears everywhere," the officer had written. "We destroy them and more appear. They cross terrain that stops our vehicles. When they break down, the Americans repair them with tools we would consider inadequate. The soldiers who drive them are often not trained mechanics, yet they keep these vehicles running under the most adverse conditions." Friedrich reviewed reports from the Eastern Front, where captured American equipment was highly prized by German forces. One report described how a German supply unit had abandoned 3 Opel trucks in favor of 2 captured Jeeps, because the American vehicles could navigate muddy roads that had stopped the German trucks completely. Another report detailed how a Jeep had been running for 6 months without major maintenance, something that was almost unheard of with German vehicles in those conditions. Hans studied reports about vehicle recovery and maintenance. The data was sobering. German vehicles that broke down often required specialized parts that took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. The Jeep's simple design meant that parts could be cannibalized from damaged vehicles. Field repairs could be made with basic tools, and in some cases, parts from other American vehicles could be adapted to work. Colonel Dietrich watched the engineers as they absorbed this information. "These reports represent the reality that our forces face every day," he said quietly. "The Americans are not out fighting us vehicle by vehicle. They are overwhelming us with quantity and reliability. When one of their vehicles is destroyed, 5 more take its place. When one breaks down, they repair it quickly or simply get another one. We cannot match that." Karl looked up from the report he was reading, and the colonel saw something in his expression that had not been there before. It was not defeat exactly, but rather a kind of terrible clarity. "Colonel," Karl said slowly, "I believe we need to expand the scope of this evaluation. We are not just looking at a vehicle. We are looking at an entire system of military logistics and industrial production. To truly understand what we are facing, we need to examine how the Americans are using these vehicles, not just how they are built." The colonel nodded. "What do you need?" "Access to more field reports, production estimates, information about American manufacturing capacity. Anything that will help us understand the complete picture." The next phase of the evaluation took on a different character. The engineers continued their technical analysis of the Jeep itself, but they also began studying the broader context. Hans requisitioned reports about American industrial capacity and was shocked by what he learned. The Americans had converted their enormous civilian automotive industry to military production almost overnight. Factories that had been building passenger cars were now building Jeeps and trucks. The production numbers were almost unbelievable. Friedrich obtained data about American manufacturing techniques and found himself studying a system that was radically different from German approaches. The Americans had standardized components across different vehicle types, meaning that a carburetor designed for a truck might also work in a Jeep. They had simplified designs to the point where workers with minimal training could assemble complex machines. They had created supply chains that could deliver parts anywhere in the world. Werner focused on the training and maintenance aspects. He learned that American mechanics were often hastily trained soldiers who had been civilians just months before, yet these men were keeping vehicles running in jungles, deserts, mountains, and Arctic conditions. The key was not in the skill of the mechanics, but in the design of the vehicles themselves. Everything about the Jeep was designed to be maintained by someone with basic tools and limited expertise. As the second week of evaluation drew to a close, the engineers began compiling their findings. Karl scheduled a preliminary briefing for Colonel Dietrich, knowing that what they had to report would not be well received in Berlin. The 4 engineers sat around a table in Karl's office, their reports and notes spread out before them. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee, the fuel that had kept them going through long days and longer nights. "Gentlemen," Karl began, "we need to be very clear about what we are going to tell the colonel. This evaluation has revealed something more significant than the specifications of a single vehicle. We have discovered a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy that gives the Americans a decisive advantage. Werner spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant certainty. The Jeep itself is unremarkable from a pure engineering standpoint. We could design a better vehicle, one with more sophisticated systems, better performance characteristics, superior comfort. But that would be missing the point entirely. The Americans have not built the best vehicle. They have built the right vehicle for their needs and their capabilities. Friedrich added his perspective. Our manufacturing system is optimized for producing small numbers of high-quality vehicles. We have skilled craftsmen, precision machinery, and rigorous quality control. The Americans have optimized for producing enormous quantities of adequate vehicles. They have semi-skilled workers, simplified designs, and quality control that focuses on function rather than perfection. In peacetime, our system would be superior. In this war, their system is winning. Hans contributed the most troubling observation. I have analyzed the materials used throughout this vehicle. In almost every case, the Americans have chosen materials that are easier to obtain, easier to process, and easier to work with. They are not using their highest quality steel for Jeeps because they are saving that steel for tanks and ships. They have created a hierarchy of resource allocation that maximizes their overall military capability. We, in contrast, are using similar quality materials for everything, which means we cannot produce enough of anything. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were not just evaluating a vehicle, they were witnessing the superiority of an entire approach to industrial warfare. Colonel Dietrich arrived that afternoon, and Karl delivered the preliminary briefing with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis. He began with the technical specifications, the measurements and analyses that documented every aspect of the Jeep's construction. Then he moved to the broader implications, the observations about American manufacturing capabilities and logistics systems. The colonel listened without interruption, his face betraying no emotion. When Karl finished, there was a long silence before Dietrich spoke. How long would it take us to replicate this vehicle? Karl had known this question was coming, had prepared his answer carefully. We could produce a similar vehicle, perhaps even a superior one from a pure engineering standpoint, within 12 to 18 months. But that is not the real question, is it, Colonel? What is the real question, Herr Hoffmann? The real question is whether we can replicate the system that produces these vehicles by the tens of thousands. And the answer to that question is no. We lack the industrial infrastructure. We lack the simplified manufacturing processes. We lack the standardized supply chains. And most importantly, we lack the time to develop them. The colonel nodded slowly. Continue your evaluation. I need a complete report, with detailed recommendations. Berlin will want options, even if those options are limited. After the colonel left, Werner voiced what they were all thinking. They will not accept our conclusions. They will find other engineers who will tell them what they want to hear. Probably, Karl agreed, but we will have done our duty by telling them the truth. The third week of evaluation focused on specific systems and subsystems. Werner dismantled the engine completely, documenting every component, every tolerance, every design choice. What he found reinforced everything they had already concluded. The engine was designed to run adequately under a wide range of conditions, rather than optimally under ideal conditions. Parts that would wear out were easy to replace. Components that might fail had simple backups or workarounds. Friedrich conducted time studies, attempting to estimate how long each assembly operation would take. He concluded that the Americans had reduced assembly time not by working faster, but by eliminating operations entirely. Where German vehicles required careful adjustment and alignment, the Jeep's design incorporated tolerances that made such adjustments unnecessary. where German vehicles used complex fasteners that required specific tools. The Jeep used simple bolts that could be installed with basic wrenches. Hans completed his metallurgical analysis and wrote a report that he knew would be controversial. He argued that the Americans were not compromising on quality, but rather redefining what quality meant in the context of military equipment. A vehicle that lasted 20 years in civilian use was over-engineered for military purposes. A vehicle that lasted 2 years but could be produced in vast numbers was more valuable strategically. During the third week, Werner received a visit from an old colleague, Klaus Brenner, who worked at the Daimler-Benz facility in Mannheim. Klaus had heard about the Jeep evaluation and was curious about the findings. The two men had studied together at the Technical University, had shared the same professors, the same ideals about engineering excellence. Over coffee in the factory canteen, Werner described what they had discovered. Klaus listened with growing disbelief, occasionally interrupting with questions that revealed his skepticism. "You are telling me that this American vehicle is superior because it is simpler?" Klaus asked, his tone suggesting he thought Werner might be joking. "Not superior in the way we have traditionally defined the term," Werner replied carefully, "but more effective for its intended purpose. Klaus, think about what we are trying to achieve in wartime. We need vehicles that can be produced quickly, maintained easily, and replaced readily. The Jeep achieves all of those goals better than anything we have designed." Klaus shook his head. "This contradicts everything we learned. Professor Richter always said that engineering was about achieving optimal performance through careful design and precise manufacturing. Professor Richter was teaching us to design civilian vehicles for the peacetime market," Werner said quietly. "The Americans are designing military vehicles for wartime conditions. Those are fundamentally different problems requiring fundamentally different solutions." The conversation stayed with Werner long after Klaus had left. He realized that he was not just challenging German engineering practices, but the entire educational system that had produced those practices. Generations of engineers had been trained to pursue a particular kind of excellence, and that training was now proving inadequate for the realities they faced. Friedrich, meanwhile, had begun conducting interviews with factory workers who had experience with both German and captured American vehicles. One mechanic, a grizzled veteran named Otto, who had served in North Africa before being wounded and reassigned to the factory, provided particularly valuable insights. "The American vehicles," Otto explained, "they are designed by people who understand that soldiers are not trained mechanics. Everything is accessible. You do not need special tools. The maintenance manual is written in simple language with clear diagrams. Compare that to our vehicles, where you sometimes need to remove half the engine to access a single component." Friedrich documented Otto's observations carefully, recognizing that they represented knowledge that could not be found in engineering textbooks. The Americans had clearly consulted with soldiers and mechanics during the design process, incorporating practical feedback that German engineers, working in isolation, had never considered. Another worker, a young woman named Greta, who had been recruited to work in the factory as men were sent to the front, offered a different perspective. She had been trained to assemble electrical harnesses for German vehicles, a task that required significant training and careful attention to detail. When shown the Jeep's electrical system, she was astonished at its simplicity. "I could have assembled this in my first week," she said, examining the straightforward wiring layout. "Why do we make things so complicated?" Friedrich had no good answer for her question. The complexity of German electrical systems was partly due to attempting to incorporate more features, but it was also due to engineering traditions that valued sophistication over simplicity. The Americans had stripped away that sophistication and, in doing so, had made production faster and more accessible to workers with limited training. As the evaluation entered its final phase, Karl scheduled a meeting with the entire team to discuss how they would present their findings. The raw data was clear, but the conclusions were politically and professionally dangerous. They needed to find a way to communicate their findings that was honest, but not inflammatory. "We must be careful," Karl cautioned, "about appearing defeatist or unpatriotic. Our findings will be controversial enough without adding emotional language that could be used to discredit the entire report." Hans disagreed. "Our responsibility is to tell the truth, not to manage political perceptions. If the High Command chooses to ignore our findings for political reasons, that is their decision, but we cannot soften our conclusions to make them more palatable." The debate continued for hours, with Friedrich eventually proposing a compromise. "We present the technical findings objectively and completely. We provide multiple options for response, even if some of those options are not realistic. We make our recommendations clear, but acknowledge the constraints and challenges. That way, we fulfill our responsibility while giving the leadership the information they need to make informed decisions." Werner added his own suggestion. "We should include in the report the positive aspects of German engineering as well. Our vehicles do excel in certain areas. The issue is not that our engineering is bad, but that it is optimized for the wrong objectives given current circumstances." The final report, when completed, was a massive document running to nearly 400 pages. It included detailed technical drawings, materials analyses, production studies, and strategic recommendations. The appendices contained field reports, worker interviews, and comparative studies. It was, by any measure, a comprehensive and rigorous evaluation. Karl wrote the executive summary with great care, knowing that many readers would only see this brief overview. He began with acknowledgement of German engineering achievements, then systematically laid out the findings about the American vehicle and its manufacturing system. He concluded with 3 potential courses of action, each with its associated timeline, cost, and probability of success. Option 1, he wrote, was to attempt to replicate the American system. This would require a complete restructuring of German manufacturing, massive investment in new facilities, retraining of the entire workforce, and a cultural shift in how quality and excellence were defined. Timeline, 3 to 5 years. Cost, equivalent to the entire annual vehicle production budget. Probability of success, low, given resource constraints and Allied bombing campaigns. Option 2 was to continue with current German vehicle designs, but attempt to incorporate some simplification principles. This would involve incremental changes to existing vehicles, focusing on ease of maintenance and parts standardization. Timeline, 12 to 18 months. Cost, moderate. Probability of success, moderate, but would not address the fundamental production quantity gap. Option 3 was to accept that German vehicle production would not match American quantities and focus instead on tactical and operational adaptations. This would mean training soldiers to make maximum use of captured enemy equipment, developing tactics that accounted for numerical inferiority, and prioritizing vehicle production for critical roles only. Timeline, immediate. Cost, minimal in terms of industrial investment, significant in terms of strategic flexibility. Probability of success, unknown, as it represented an entirely different approach to mechanized warfare. Karl knew that option 3 was the only realistic choice, but he also knew it would be the least acceptable to military leadership. Admitting that Germany could not match American production was tantamount to admitting eventual defeat in a war of attrition. The formal presentation of the report took place in late November, 6 weeks after the evaluation had begun. Colonel Dietrich, had arranged for several senior officers from the procurement office to attend, along with representatives from the major vehicle manufacturers. The meeting room was in a building adjacent to the hangar, a utilitarian space with walls covered in maps and production schedules. Karl stood at the front of the room, his report displayed on a table, flanked by Werner, Friedrich, and Hans. The audience of approximately 20 men watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Several of the manufacturer representatives had already heard rumors about the report's conclusions and had come prepared to defend their company's approaches. "Gentlemen," Karl began, his voice steady despite his nervousness, "over the past 6 weeks, my team has conducted a comprehensive evaluation of a captured American Jeep. Our findings have implications that extend far beyond the technical specifications of a single vehicle. What we have discovered is that the Americans have developed an integrated system of vehicle design, manufacturing, and logistics that gives them a significant strategic advantage." He walked them through the technical findings, using photographs and diagrams to illustrate key points. He showed the simple engine design, the standardized components, the accessibility for maintenance. He presented the production time comparisons, the resource requirement analyses, the field performance reports. As he spoke, Karl watched the reactions in the room. Some men were taking careful notes, genuinely interested in the findings. Others sat with arms crossed, their body language defensive. A few were whispering to colleagues, already formulating objections. When Karl reached the strategic implications section, the room's tension increased palpably. This is where he would move from technical observations to uncomfortable truths about German industrial capabilities. "The fundamental challenge we face," Karl stated clearly, "is not technical, but systematic. We have optimized our industrial base for producing small numbers of sophisticated vehicles. The Americans have optimized their industrial base for producing large numbers of adequate vehicles. In the current strategic situation, their approach is more effective." A manufacturer representative, Herr Kruger from the Volkswagen Works, interrupted, "Are you suggesting that American engineering is superior to German engineering? That seems an extraordinary claim given our long history of automotive excellence." Karl had expected this challenge. "I am not suggesting that American engineering is superior in all respects. I am suggesting that American engineering is better matched to the requirements of modern industrial warfare. Their vehicles may be less sophisticated, but they are more numerous, more reliable in field conditions, and easier to produce and maintain." "But surely," Kruger persisted, "with sufficient resources, we could produce similar vehicles in comparable quantities." Friedrich stepped forward to address this point. "Herr Kruger, I have studied your company's production facilities extensively. You currently produce the Kübelwagen using methods that require skilled labor and specialized equipment. To match American Jeep production, you would need to completely redesign your factory floor, retrain your entire workforce, and restructure your supply chain. The investment required would be enormous, and the timeline would be measured in years, not months." Another officer, a major from the procurement office, raised a different concern. "Even if everything you say is accurate, what are we supposed to do with this information? We cannot simply abandon our entire industrial infrastructure and copy American methods." "That is precisely the dilemma," Karl acknowledged. "Which is why our report presents multiple options, each with its associated trade-offs. The reality is that there are no easy solutions." The meeting continued for another 3 hours, with questions, challenges, and debates. Werner presented the detailed technical comparisons. Hans defended his materials analyses against suggestions that he had been too generous in his assessment of American metallurgy. Friedrich walked through production scenarios, demonstrating why simple replication was not feasible. By the end of the meeting, the audience was divided. Some seemed convinced by the evidence and troubled by its implications. Others remained skeptical, clinging to their belief in German engineering superiority. A few seemed to understand the strategic significance, but were uncertain about how to respond. Colonel Dietrich closed the meeting with a simple statement. "This report will be forwarded to the High Command with my strongest recommendation that its findings be taken seriously. Whether they choose to act on those findings is beyond our control." After the audience had left, the four engineers remained in the room, exhausted by the intensity of the presentation and the debates that had followed. They had done what they set out to do. They had conducted a thorough evaluation and reported their findings honestly. But they all understood that honesty was not always welcome, especially when it challenged fundamental assumptions. In the weeks that followed, the report made its way through various levels of military and industrial bureaucracy. Some recipients read it carefully and were troubled by its conclusions. Others dismissed it as defeatist or excessively pessimistic. A few recognized its strategic importance, but felt powerless to implement the kinds of changes it suggested. Werner, Friedrich, and Hans returned to their regular duties, but the experience of the evaluation had changed them fundamentally. They continued to work on vehicle designs and manufacturing improvements, but they now approached their work with a different perspective. They understood that engineering excellence was not an absolute standard, but a context-dependent goal. Karl, however, found himself unable to move past the evaluation. He had spent 30 years building his career on certain principles, and those principles had been revealed as inadequate. He struggled with depression and doubt, questioning not just his recent work, but his entire professional legacy. On the evening of the 20th day, Karl began drafting the executive summary of their report. He wrote by hand, scratching out sentences, rewriting paragraphs, searching for the precise language that would convey both the technical details and the strategic implications. "The American Jeep," he wrote, "represents a paradigm shift in military vehicle design and production. The vehicle itself is not technologically advanced. Indeed, by German engineering standards, it is primitive in many respects. However, this simplicity is not a flaw, but a carefully considered design philosophy that prioritizes manufacturability, maintainability, and reliability over performance optimization." He paused, considering his next words carefully. The implications for German military strategy are profound. The Americans have created a system that can produce adequate equipment in overwhelming quantities. This approach, combined with their vast industrial capacity, gives them a strategic advantage that cannot be overcome through superior design alone. German vehicles may be better in individual comparison, but the Americans can field 10 vehicles for every one we produce. Karl continued writing late into the night, laying out the technical details, the production estimates, the strategic analysis. As he wrote, he felt the weight of what he was documenting. This was not just a report about a vehicle. It was a report about the future of the war itself. The next morning, Werner arrived early and found Karl asleep at his desk, his head resting on the nearly completed report. Werner quietly read what Karl had written, and when the older man woke, Werner met his eyes with a mixture of respect and sorrow. "This will not be well received," Werner said quietly. "No," Karl agreed. "But it is the truth, and the truth is what we owe them, even if they do not want to hear it." The final days of the evaluation were spent verifying measurements, double-checking calculations, and ensuring that every conclusion was supported by solid evidence. The engineers knew that their report would be challenged, and they wanted to make certain that it could withstand scrutiny. Friedrich compiled the production analysis into a detailed appendix, complete with time studies, resource requirements, and manufacturing workflow diagrams. His conclusion was stark. To match American Jeep production, Germany would need to build approximately 15 new factories, train 50,000 workers in new manufacturing techniques, and completely redesign its supply chain infrastructure. The timeline for this would be measured in years, not months. The resources required would be equivalent to building several hundred tanks. Hans prepared a comprehensive materials analysis that documented every alloy, every fastener, every component. His report included recommendations for potential German substitutes, but he was honest about the limitations. In many cases, we could use higher quality materials, but this would increase costs and complexity without meaningful improvement in battlefield performance. The American approach of using adequate materials matched to the intended purpose is more efficient from a military-industrial standpoint. Werner wrote a detailed technical comparison between the Jeep and comparable German vehicles. He structured his analysis to be as objective as possible, but the conclusions were unavoidable. German vehicles offered superior performance in many individual metrics, but the Jeep offered superior overall value when production costs, maintenance requirements, and battlefield reliability were considered. As they compiled the final report, the engineers found themselves discussing not just the technical details, but the broader philosophical questions raised by their evaluation. They had dedicated their careers to pursuing engineering excellence, and now they were confronting evidence that excellence might not be the right goal. Hans articulated what they were all feeling during one of their late-night working sessions. We have been trained to optimize individual components, to pursue perfection in design and manufacturing. The Americans have optimized the entire system, accepting imperfection in components to achieve superiority in overall capability. It is a fundamentally different way of thinking about engineering. Hans completed his metallurgical analysis and delivered his report to Karl with obvious reluctance. The steel used in the chassis and body is of moderate quality, nothing exceptional. The Americans are using steel that we would consider suitable for civilian applications, not military vehicles. They are saving their high-quality steel for tanks and ships. But the design compensates for the material limitations through structural redundancy and simplicity. Karl listened to report after report, each one challenging his fundamental understanding of engineering excellence. The transmission was a 3-speed unit with a 2-speed transfer case, nothing sophisticated, but almost impossible to break even under severe abuse. The electrical system used lower voltage than German standards, making it less prone to failure in wet conditions. The fuel system was gravity-fed, eliminating the need for complex pumps. Friedrich spent an entire week analyzing the production implications, and his final report was perhaps the most devastating of all. Herr Hoffmann, based on my analysis, I estimate that the Americans can produce this vehicle in approximately 1/10 the time it takes us to produce a comparable Kübelwagen. The tooling is simpler, the parts count is lower, the assembly process is streamlined. They have designed this vehicle specifically for mass production in a way that we have never considered. That evening, Karl sat alone in his office. A single lamp illuminating the stacks of reports and technical drawings that covered every surface. He had been an engineer for 3 decades, had contributed to designs that he believed represented the peak of automotive achievement. The Mercedes-Benz vehicles that German officers drove were marvels of engineering, comfortable, powerful, beautifully crafted. But they took months to build, required skilled craftsmen, and broke down when subjected to the harsh realities of combat conditions. The American Jeep was none of those things. It was loud, uncomfortable, Spartan in its appointments. But it worked, day after day, in conditions that destroyed more sophisticated vehicles. It could be manufactured by workers who had been building farm equipment 6 months earlier. It could be repaired by soldiers who had been farmers themselves before the war. It could be produced in such quantities that losing one was inconsequential. Werner knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. They had worked together long enough that formality had long since disappeared during these late-night sessions. "Sir, I have been reviewing the engine specifications again, trying to find some way that we could adapt our production facilities to manufacture something similar. And it cannot be done, not in any time frame that would matter. Our factories are set up for precision manufacturing. Our entire industrial philosophy is based on producing small numbers of high-quality units. To build something like this Jeep, we would have to completely rebuild our manufacturing infrastructure. The machinery, the training, the quality control processes, everything would have to change. We would essentially have to become American in our approach to manufacturing." Carl nodded slowly. He had reached the same conclusion himself, had been avoiding putting it into words. The Americans had not simply built a better vehicle, they had built a better system for building vehicles. They had integrated design, manufacturing, and field maintenance into a coherent philosophy that German industry, for all its vaunted superiority, could not match. Friedrich entered the office, holding yet another report. "I have calculated production numbers based on intelligence estimates. The Americans are manufacturing these vehicles at a rate of approximately 1,000 per day across multiple facilities. 1,000 per day. We cannot produce any vehicle at 1/10 that rate." The three men sat in silence, contemplating the implications. The war in Russia was consuming vehicles at a rate that German industry could not sustain. Every tank, every truck, every car required skilled labor and sophisticated machinery. German factories were bombing targets, and when they were damaged, production stopped completely because the manufacturing processes were so specialized. The Americans, with their simpler designs and distributed manufacturing, could sustain losses that would cripple German industry. Hans arrived last, his report completed. "Gentlemen, I have examined every component of this vehicle. The materials are inferior by our standards, but they are adequate for the purpose. The Americans have understood something that we have not. They are not trying to build the best vehicle. They are trying to build the right vehicle for the circumstances. They have matched their industrial capabilities to their military needs in a way that we have failed to do." Colonel Dietrich had been receiving regular requests from High Command for updates on the evaluation. He understood that powerful men in Berlin were expecting good news, expecting to hear that German industry could quickly replicate these American vehicles and match their production numbers. He also understood that Karl Hoffmann was a man of rigid honesty, incapable of providing the comforting lies that those men wanted to hear. The colonel visited the hangar on a grey morning 2 weeks after the evaluation had begun. Karl and his team were conducting final measurements, documenting details that might somehow provide a path forward. The colonel watched them work, these men who had devoted their lives to engineering excellence, now confronted with evidence that excellence might be the wrong goal. "Herr Hoffmann, I need your preliminary findings for the High Command," the colonel said quietly. "They are expecting a report that will tell them how quickly we can begin production of a comparable vehicle." Karl set down his calipers and turned to face the colonel. For a long moment, he simply looked at the Jeep, this olive-drab symbol of everything his engineering education had taught him to reject. Then he looked back at the colonel, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a man abandoning beliefs he had held for a lifetime. "Tell them we cannot do it. Tell them that the American industrial system is fundamentally different from ours. Tell them that replicating this vehicle would require rebuilding our entire manufacturing infrastructure, retraining our entire workforce, and abandoning the engineering principles that German industry has followed for generations. Tell them that even if we started today, it would take years to achieve production rates that the Americans are achieving now." The colonel's face remained impassive, but his eyes showed that he had expected this answer. "And if they insist on a timeline?" Carl reached for his notebook, flipped through pages of calculations and specifications, and then closed it with a decisive snap. "Colonel, I can give them numbers. I can tell them that with unlimited resources and no interference from Allied bombing, we might be able to produce a similar vehicle within 18 months and reach meaningful production volumes within 3 years. But those numbers would be lies. The truth is that we cannot replicate what the Americans have done because we are not the Americans. Our entire industrial culture is different. We have optimized for quality over quantity, for sophistication over simplicity, for perfection over pragmatism. Those choices made sense in peacetime. In this war, they are destroying us." The words hung in the cold air of the hangar. Werner, Friedrich, and Hans had stopped working and were listening, their faces reflecting the same realization that Carl had articulated. They were not just evaluating a vehicle. They were witnessing the obsolescence of their own expertise. Colonel Dietrich nodded slowly. "I will convey your assessment to Berlin. I suspect they will not receive it well. They will demand a second evaluation," Carl predicted, "probably by engineers who will be more willing to provide optimistic timelines." "Undoubtedly, but you will have done your duty by telling them the truth." After the colonel left, the engineers continued their work with mechanical precision, but the enthusiasm had drained away. They were completing a task that no longer seemed to matter. The measurements they took, the specifications they recorded, the analyses they completed, all of it was documentation of a gap that could not be closed. Friedrich broke the silence first, his voice rough with emotion. "I've spent 15 years optimizing manufacturing processes, learning how to shave minutes off production times, how to improve quality control, how to train workers to achieve precision. And now I'm looking at a vehicle that achieves better results by abandoning everything I have learned." Werner nodded in agreement. "I designed suspension systems for the Hawk vehicles that the generals drive, systems that provided a comfortable ride on paved roads. This Jeep has a suspension that would be at home on a farm tractor, and yet it performs better in actual combat conditions." Hans added his own observation, his academic precision making the admission even more painful. "I have published papers on metallurgy, on achieving optimal material properties through careful processing. The Americans are using metal that I would have rejected as substandard, and yet their vehicles are lasting longer than ours in the field." Carl listened to his colleagues, these brilliant men who were confronting the limits of their expertise. He understood their pain because he felt it himself. They had devoted their lives to a particular vision of excellence, and that vision was being revealed as inadequate for the world they now inhabited. The weeks passed, and the final report took shape. It was a thick document, filled with technical specifications, detailed drawings, materials analyses, and production estimates. But the conclusion was inescapable, rendered in the precise language of engineering evaluation, but carrying the weight of a strategic catastrophe. Carl wrote the executive summary himself, choosing each word carefully. The American Jeep represents a fundamentally different approach to military vehicle design, one that prioritizes manufacturing efficiency and field reliability over engineering sophistication. The vehicle's simplicity is not a weakness, but a carefully considered design philosophy. German industry lacks the manufacturing infrastructure, trained workforce, and industrial culture necessary to replicate this approach in any meaningful time frame. Attempts to do so would require resources that are not available and time that we do not have. He paused, looking at those words, knowing that they would be read by men who would not want to believe them. Then he added the final sentence, the conclusion that summarized months of analysis in the starkest possible terms. "We cannot replicate this vehicle with our current capabilities." The report was delivered to Colonel Dietrich, who forwarded it through the chain of command to Berlin. Karl and his team returned to their regular duties, working on incremental improvements to existing German vehicles, knowing that their efforts were inadequate, but continuing because that was what engineers did. They solved problems, even unsolvable ones. 3 months later, Werner received a letter from an old friend who was serving with a Panzer division in Russia. The letter described the brutal winter conditions, the constant vehicle breakdowns, the desperate efforts to keep equipment running in temperatures that froze fuel lines and cracked engine blocks. And then, almost as an afterthought, the friend mentioned that captured American vehicles were prized above almost any other equipment. German soldiers would sometimes abandon their own vehicles to drive captured jeeps because the American vehicles simply kept working when German equipment failed. Werner showed the letter to Karl, and they both understood that it confirmed everything their evaluation had concluded. The American industrial system had produced a vehicle that was exactly suited to the needs of modern warfare, and German industry, for all its reputation for excellence, had failed to match it. Hans published a paper after the war, when such things could be discussed openly, about the relationship between engineering sophistication and practical effectiveness. He used the Jeep evaluation as his central example, arguing that engineering excellence must be defined not by the sophistication of the solution, but by how well the solution meets the actual needs it is intended to serve. The paper was widely read and became a standard reference in discussions of engineering philosophy. Friedrich took a position with a civilian automotive manufacturer after the war ended, and he applied the lessons he had learned from that evaluation to civilian production. He helped revolutionize German manufacturing by introducing American-style mass production techniques, helping rebuild an industry that had been shattered by the war. He never forgot the lesson of the Jeep, that sometimes simplicity was not a compromise, but a virtue. Karl retired shortly after the war ended, his health broken by years of stress and the knowledge that he had seen the future and been unable to change it. He spent his final years writing his memoirs, and an entire chapter was devoted to the Jeep evaluation. He wrote with the clarity that comes from hindsight, acknowledging that German engineering had been trapped by its own success, unable to adapt to a world where good enough manufactured in quantity was superior to perfect manufactured in small numbers. The Jeep itself, the actual vehicle that had been evaluated in Hangar 7, survived the war. It was found by American forces when they captured the Stuttgart facility in the spring of 1945. Some officer recognized it as an American vehicle and arranged for it to be shipped back to the United States. It eventually ended up in a military museum, a common-looking Jeep among thousands of similar vehicles, with no outward indication of the role it had played in revealing the weakness of German industrial strategy. Years later, a researcher going through captured German documents found Karl Hoffmann's evaluation report. It was a thick file, hundreds of pages of technical analysis, but what caught the researcher's attention was a handwritten note attached to the cover page. It was dated several months after the original report, and it appeared to be a response from High Command to Colonel Dietrich's request for guidance. The note was brief, just 3 sentences long, but those sentences summarized the entire tragedy of German strategic planning in the war's latter years. The report's conclusions are noted. Production of a comparable vehicle is assigned lowest priority due to resource constraints. Focus all efforts on improving existing vehicle designs. In other words, the High Command had received the warning, understood the implications, and chosen to do nothing. They had decided to continue down the path they were on, hoping that incremental improvements to existing designs would somehow be sufficient, unwilling or unable to acknowledge that the problem was not with individual vehicles, but with the entire system of production and deployment. The researcher included Karl's report in a study of German industrial planning during the war, and it became a case study in how organizations can fail to adapt to changing circumstances even when they have clear evidence of the need to change. Military academies used it to teach lessons about the importance of strategic flexibility. Engineering schools used it to teach lessons about the difference between theoretical excellence and practical effectiveness. But for Karl and his colleagues, who had conducted that evaluation in the cold hangar during the autumn of 1943, the lessons had been immediate and personal. They had been confronted with evidence that challenged everything they believed about their profession, and they had responded with honesty, even when that honesty was unwelcome. Werner, in his later years, would sometimes talk about that evaluation with younger engineers. He would describe the Jeep, that simple, crude-looking vehicle, and the profound effect it had had on his understanding of his profession. Young engineers, eager to demonstrate their knowledge of advanced technologies, would sometimes seem disappointed by his emphasis on simplicity and reliability. One young engineer once asked him directly, "Herr Dr. Schultz, with all due respect, are you suggesting that we should abandon the pursuit of engineering excellence?" Werner had smiled at that question, recognizing in it the same certainty that he had felt in his own youth. "Not at all," he had replied, "but I am suggesting that we must be very careful about how we define excellence." The Jeep was excellent at what it was designed to do. It was not the most sophisticated vehicle ever built, not the most comfortable, not the most powerful, but it was the right vehicle for the circumstances, and that is a kind of excellence that cannot be ignored. The story of Karl Hoffmann and his team standing in that hangar and confronting the reality of American industrial power became more than just a technical evaluation. It became a parable about the dangers of rigidity, about the importance of matching solutions to actual needs rather than to theoretical ideals, about the necessity of being willing to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence demands it. The three words that summarize their findings, "we cannot replicate," were not an admission of personal failure, but a recognition of systemic limitations. German industry, for all its strengths, was not structured to produce the kind of simple, reliable, mass-produced equipment that modern warfare demanded. That insight, clearly stated in the autumn of 1943, might have led to fundamental changes in German industrial strategy if it had been acted upon, but it was not acted upon, and the consequences played out on battlefields from Normandy to the Rhineland. German forces fought with courage and skill, often with locally superior equipment, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of adequate equipment that the Allied industrial base could produce. The lesson of the Jeep, that sometimes good enough in large numbers beats excellent in small numbers, was taught over and over again throughout the war's final years. Karl Hoffmann died in 1953, 10 years after conducting the evaluation that had defined the final phase of his career. His obituary in the technical press mentioned his many contributions to automotive engineering over a distinguished career, but it made no mention of the Jeep evaluation. That report remained classified for decades, a minor document in the vast archives of wartime technical assessments. But among engineers, especially those who had lived through the war and understood its lessons, Karl's work on that evaluation was well known. He had been a man who told the truth when lies would have been easier, who acknowledged limitations when optimism would have been more welcome, who recognized fundamental problems when incremental solutions would have been more comfortable to propose. The American Jeep, designed by engineers who were trying to solve a specific problem with limited time and resources, became one of the most successful military vehicles in history. More than 500,000 were produced during the war years, and they served in every theatre of combat. After the war, the design influenced civilian vehicles around the world, demonstrating that the principles of simplicity and reliability had value far beyond military applications. In the end, the story of Karl Hoffmann and the Jeep evaluation was not really about vehicles at all. It was about the difficulty of seeing clearly when your vision is shaped by assumptions that no longer match reality. It was about the courage required to report inconvenient truths. It was about the difference between theoretical superiority and practical effectiveness. And it was about the price that nations and organizations pay when they cannot adapt to changing circumstances, even when those circumstances are clearly visible. The engineers who conducted that evaluation went on to other projects, other challenges, other opportunities to apply their expertise. But they never forgot the lesson of that autumn in 1943, when they had been confronted with a simple American vehicle and forced to acknowledge that sometimes the most sophisticated answer is not the right answer at all.